Hi, and welcome to our next screencast. Today we're going to be talking about the chemistry for biology. And before we can get into the human body and know and understand all the processes that happen inside us, we have to understand a little bit about the chemicals that are inside us and make all of the things happen. Atoms are joined together with bonds, and when atoms are joined together, they make compounds. And there's energy stored in these bonds. It takes energy to break the bonds, and it takes energy to make the bonds. We'll start talking about the ionic bond. You'll see here that the red atom is representing a metal, and the blue atom is representing a nonmetal. When a metal gives 1, 2, 3 electrons away to the nonmetal, then they form what's called an ionic bond. Atoms all want to be stable, and if a metal has an extra electron in its valence shell, its outermost shell, and a nonmetal needs one more electron in its outer shell to have a full outer shell, then they can both become more stable if the metal gives its extra electron to the nonmetal. What that does is it makes the metal a positive ion. Positive because it's given away negative charges. And it makes the nonmetal a negative ion. And that's because it has taken extra negative electrons. Now that the metal and the nonmetal are charged ions, they're opposites. And we all know that opposites attract. And that is what holds ions together to form a bond. So the negative nonmetal and the positive metal ions are now attracted to each other and they form this ionic bond. And ionic bonds are quite weak when we compare them to the next type of bond. The covalent bond happens between a nonmetal and a nonmetal. For example, carbon and oxygen, oxygen and oxygen. When two nonmetals come close together, it would take a lot of energy for a nonmetal to give away all of its valence electrons because it has so many of them. What it would prefer to do is share. So covalently bonded nonmetals share their electrons with each other. And in doing so, they form a much stronger. It's harder to take covalently bonded molecules apart than it is to take ionically bonded molecules apart. So here's an ionic bond again. So when sodium is by itself, it is an atom. You see this particular atom has one valence electron. Chlorine, as an atom, has 7 valence electrons. 2, 4, 6, and 7. It needs one more to be happy. So sodium gives its electron to chlorine. Chlorine becomes a charged ion. Sodium becomes a charged ion. And then they form that bond. Here is what a covalent bond looks like. So hydrogen, this hydrogen molecule has one outermost valence electron. This hydrogen has one outermost valence electron. Hydrogen, because it only has one electron shell, it only needs 2 electrons to be stable, to be full, to be happy. And when 2 hydrogens get together, what happens is these electrons are shared. So sometimes they'll be over here, sometimes they'll be over here. And at any one time, each of the hydrogen molecules is now happy, stable. So, in human biology, there are some atoms that are more important than others. 96 to 99% of our bodies are just made up of 4 simple atoms or elements: oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen. There are other elements that are also important: phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, calcium, iron, and I'm sure you can think of others. But carbon is the most important of all. It is It is found in almost all of the molecules that make up living things. Carbon is what we call the backbone of life. You find carbon in molecules like this. This is a fat molecule. You find carbon in molecules like this. This is thymidine, or the T from DNA, A, C, T, and G. Thymidine, you see all the carbons. Carbon, 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 carbon. This is fructose. It's a type of sugar, or carb. Again, you see all of these carbons. And then, of course, you have your amino acids, which make up proteins. And again, it's the carbons in the backbone. So carbons make fats, they make DNA, they make carbs like sugars, and they make proteins using amino acids. So carbon molecules are known as organic molecules. There are a few special properties of carbon that you should be familiar with. Carbon's really small, it's light, it can bond with 4 different things. In this case, it's bonded with 4 hydrogens, but it can form single bonds, as you see here in this fat. It can form double bonds, as you see here in this benzene ring. It can even form triple bonds. Those carbons can form chains like this, or they can form rings like this. It's a very versatile atom. And the best part about it is it's very common in stars, very common on the Earth, and very common in you. So carbon compounds work the way they do because of these special groups that are a part of them. And these groups are called functional groups. And this is the part of the compound or molecule that's involved in reactions. There's 5 that you don't need to memorize, but you will need to recognize as we go through the rest of the year. We're going to be talking about a lot of molecules and chemicals, and these are some of the functional groups that we're going to come across. First is the hydroxide group. Now, the hydroxide group is basically an OH group. An OH group is an alcohol. So if you see anything that ends in all, ethanol, alcohol, methanol, it usually has an OH group on the end. These are all basic because they absorb hydrogen ions.
The second functional group is the carboxyl group. That is the COO group that you see here. Sometimes you'll see it like this. Sometimes you'll see it like this. Normally you'll see on an amino acid. So you see here the COOH on this amino acid 1 and amino acid 2. All amino acids have a carboxyl group. Carboxyl groups are acids, and what they do is they help to form a bond between the amino acids, and that bond is called a peptide bond. You'll learn a lot more about that later. Another group you'll need to recognize is the amine group. The amine group is an NH2 group. You'll either see it as NH2 or you'll see it as NH3+. Again, you see these on amino acids, and they join up with the carboxyl groups to make protein chains as well. Another functional group you should be familiar with is the sulfhydryl group, or the SH group. And these are the thiols. The only place that we'll talk about them this year is when we talk about proteins, and there are sulfur bridges, which help to give shape to proteins. And lastly, and probably the most important group we'll talk about this year, is the phosphate group. The phosphate group is a phosphorus joined with 4 oxygens. PO4 negative. That's a phosphate group. And the phosphate group is special because it can rotate. And by rotating its double bond, it's really good at energy transfer, which is why we find 3 phosphates in ATP. So here's ATP, 1 phosphate, 2 phosphates, and 3 phosphates. And it's the energy of trying to shove those really negatively charged molecules. Takes a lot of energy, so when those bonds are broken, it releases energy. The other place where we see a lot of phosphate groups is in DNA and RNA. So phosphate actually helps to form that backbone of DNA. So when you see that twisted up ladder that represents a DNA molecule. The twisting action comes from that rotating double bond of the phosphates. So try to guess what these are. OH group, hydroxide. PO4, there's your phosphate group. COOH, carboxyl group. There's your NH group, that's your amino group. And your SH group, your thiol. So make sure you come to class with your hot questions.